I gave you guys reference, right, in context in terms of the previous episode about Black womanhood, redefining Black womanhood, and so forth. And I think to an extent we understand that Black women really have to be strong, right? It's strength in being able to muster the courage to go on after heartbreak, right? Without having community, right? Oftentimes to kind of help you get through those things, to get through, relational disappointments, right? Which for many of us is perpetual. I think, conversations that we have had about availability, access, and all the things, and just disproportionately in comparison to Black men and them benefiting from patriarchy, right, in the sense that they are men, but also benefiting in terms of desirability, right? And I love really sitting here talking about this because I do think, what they say, trying to explain, Black men and their benefit within their privilege, rather, within American society is sort of like trying to explain to white women, I think their benefits within American society as well, right? There's sort of like this blindness to the privilege, but also like this sort of like narcissism, and I absolutely love that, right? Because I think that is so true, and so I think when people rebuttal when I said about Michelle Obama and it being dishonorable to a certain extent when I was referencing like marital unity. And, one might rebuttal, well, we don't know how Barack is treating Michelle. And we typically result to that argument or that sentiment rather whenever we are talking about women in relationships, right? I think one is because by default, Black women oftentimes just get a lot of slack, a lot of flack, right? In terms of how to be, how they need to do more, be more, show up differently, and so forth in their relationships with Black men, and how it's always pretty much Black women's fault of why something, essentially isn't working, right? Or how we need to be softer, how we need to be this, how we need to be that. And so I get that argument. And then I also think, right, as I'm just thinking about it today, I also think that in oftentimes being partnered with a Black man, and I think we need to talk about this, right? There is sort of like this entitlement and this sense of like knowing, right, for many of them that they carry, that they know that there are many other women out there who are quote unquote, desirable. I think they are aware of their desirability within American society from both ends, right? In terms of Black women, in terms of white women and Asian women, in all women, even if that desirability really kind of hunches on nothing more than performative sexuality, right? This hypersexuality. And so as degrading as it is, right? It feeds into the patriarchy. It feeds into this sort of like sexual performance that gives a lot of men a sense of confidence and bravado, right? And so they don't look at it through a critical lens oftentimes to say, well, I'm only desired because of, how my sexuality is portrayed and all these different things. It's more so like, hey, desirability is desirability. I am wanted. And that's really all that matters. Right. And then I think for the Black men who maybe don't fit into this sort of like category, I think that there, for all of the male life coaches out there who, sort of do this work of constantly talking to women, talking at women about men and all these different things, I don't really think that there's a lot of wisdom in those conversations. And I don't think there's a lot of wisdom within men's spaces either. And a part of me is actually going to feel like I don't want to say I'm projecting my values, but I do think that as I'm getting ready to explain this, I do want to kind of pause and just kind of warn my listeners that I do think a part of me kind of holds a different set of values, right? And I know some of those values may be considered outdated, right? In this polyamorous culture, they may be, be considered outdated in this culture that just, is the modern man and modern woman, right? People don't really operate in the same way, but a lot of men don't realize, when you meet a woman and she is a source of inspiration for you, right? She lights up your world. Your days are better when you're around her, right? You feel a sense of ease. You feel a sense of inspiration and you feel motivation and all these different things, right? You feel as though that is something that you can find easily, right? You feel as though that is something that is to be consumed, right? Something that is not to be revered, respected, or protected, right? Like, but you see that as you know, a commonality, right? You're like, I'm sure I've been around other women and it's like, it's not a big deal. You know what I mean? Or you feel like, you know what, I feel this sense of inspiration. I'm going to leave you, right? And I'm going to go out in the world. I'm going to find something better, or I'm going to go off and be this great guy. And you sort of like unplug from the source, right? And I would say that source being God, not to say that women are God, but more so to say that, you know, God word says when you find a wife, or, you know, you find a good thing, you obtain favor from the Lord, right? And so it's like, I do think in part because there just is not a lot of wisdom, whether it's biblical, whether it's just learning how to honor women. I just don't think that a lot of brothers are taught that. You know what I mean? And I don't want to speak so matter of factly, right? I want to talk about on average, like when I come on here to talk about certain things, right? Like when I made the video about African American people and our regression and the immaturity that really plagues the Black community. I've been speaking about this for almost 3 years now. I wrote a whole piece on it on Medium. And, you know, people are like, well, you know, people can grow and people can change and all these different things. And I'm not negating that, right? I'm not taking away from that. I'm not speaking so matter of factly, but I am speaking on average. And I do think in part doing that, sometimes when we do speak on average, right, we are actually speaking to the exceptions, right? We're speaking to people who do grow, right? We're speaking to Black men who are healed and who are faithful, who understand the, you know, the favor that, you know, God places on their lives to be with a woman, or when they're coupled with their wives, and they're honorable and all these different things. There are men who are just faithful and who are married and who value stability, right? Like, I'm not talking about those men. And I do think a lot of times on my channel and the work that I, you know, things that how I speak and how I talk, like I do think a lot of times my channel tracks those type of men, right? So I do want to be mindful of that, because like I said, I think sometimes when we are speaking to the degenerate few, right? They're not really under the voice, the sound of my voice, right? It's actually the opposite. So I always want to keep that in mind. But back to, you know, in listening to the criticisms in regards to womanhood and strength and Michelle Obama, right, and relational dynamics and marital unity, I do think in part, you know, that attitude in being partnered with Black men on average, I do think it comes out, and I do think, you know, it kind of spills out in other ways, right? It could be something that is more overt. It could be something that's more, you know, introvert, you know, and it could be something that is conscious or unconscious, right? But I do think there is this sort of like pervasiveness, where there is this awareness of privilege, right? Where there is this awareness of this really like absurd desirability, right? There's this awareness of quote unquote shortage in men and so few. And even if men aren't even consciously thinking about this, like critically, they don't even have an understanding of it. I do think that they are very perceptive to how the world perceives them. And I think they're perceptive to, you know, being partnered with women and being around other women and kind of seeing that sort of like flirtation and desirability. And obviously we know that that's not just a Black man's thing, right? That's just a woman's thing, whatever it is. Somebody says it's pheromones. I don't know, right? Whatever it is, when men are partnered, some women, right, may want them more, right? That's why they say when you get a girlfriend or you get married, you know, people start climbing out the woodworks, you know, but when you were single, they weren't checking for you, you know. So it's just a very interesting, thing. And I won't say that, you know, I personally still wouldn't want to believe that Barack Obama is playing childish games with Michelle and making her feel like she's not good enough and that he can get a better one, or that, you know, he could do better. Or, you know what I mean? Like, I personally don't really want to follow that stream of thought. But I do think that, you know, in listening to the criticisms, like I said, I do think that that is an attitude that is very prevalent. And so, you know, in terms of healing, I don't really know. You know, I don't really think that we have enough. I think if we wanted to have conversations with Black men and Black women and Black men listening to what it is that Black women, I don't want to say go through, but experience in relationship with them, more so from like growth perspective, right? To grow and to be more consciously aware of their relationships with Black women, especially if they desire to be with Black women. I think that education had to start in the classroom, right? Because I think it needs to be in a regulated setting. I think it needs to be with, you know, certain, like in a certain type of agenda, right? Certain type of criteria, because I think it needs to be in a structured manner. And I think that, you know, it should have been a thing where early on Black boys were taught about the struggles of black enslaved women. And, that in contrast to that of the kept and material comforted and resourced and, you know what I mean? Privileged white woman. Right. And then I think it would have had to probably start with, recognizing how black women were, oftentimes, forced to partner with white men in terms of sexual acts. Right. All these different things that were without consent, how black men were, maybe spoken at and emasculated in such ways, but were not ever castrated or, experiencing some type of like sexual abuse, right, at the hands of white men and white women, but black women were. And so I think that if you wanted to educate black men on, sort of like the breakdown and why it is that they have this sort of like privilege within American society and being men and being highly desired, right? Having all of these sort of like reputable, positive, I would say more so positive stereotypes, in the sense of like around certain white people, right? Because I think we don't want to speak matter of factly, right? At the end of the day, we are all in this together. Okay. And, black men still experience negative stereotypes depending on the environment, depending on the setting, right? There's always sort of like this attitude that some white people will have, and whether it's subconscious or unconscious, that rejects black bodies in certain spaces. So it's sort of like who's worthy and who's unworthy. There's a sort of like, suspicion that I think, the white gaze will follow in regards to black men. And we obviously see that with, police brutality, and other, unfortunately murders and things like that have taken place across the country, some videotaped and some not, and so forth. And so we don't want to veer too far left, and we don't want to, I want to be mindful to kind of address the realities that we definitely all go through it together. But I do think in terms of having conversations today and why, even podcasts with the best intentions are very unproductive in terms of getting to the root of the dating and all the different things, is that, it would have had to start early, if you ask me. So it's not something that I personally care to expound upon and go down this rabbit hole to try to educate black men on honoring black women and why, all these different things from religion to culture to, quote unquote family units, right? And, black wealth and, how that could help their finances and all. Like, I don't really care to go down that rabbit hole because, like I said, I think that by and large, I'm sorry, not they, but we collectively are missing a very foundational structure, which is the educational piece in regards to how do we get here. And I think that educational piece is so foundational that it's really kind of hard to replace that, right? Because now we're living in a day and age where people are getting their media, their information from all over the place, right? And it would be different if we were all, in a structured setting, reading the same book, right? Being able to engage with one another in a safe space, right? And that's probably one of the most disheartening things about our educational system. And you talk about all the ways in which it's failed us. Well, it's failed us in the sense that it really did remove such a pivotal part of our upbringing, our belonging, our cultural norms, our, way of relating to one another and just all the different things, right? And most importantly, our history. And so now here you are and you have sort of like these fragments of the story, and it depends on who's telling the story, right? In Clint Smith's book, How the Word is Passed, right? If you're listening to white Americans even to this day tell the story, it's completely different. And if you find yourself, being in social circles that are more upwardly mobile, and you are of, obviously the minority, then you're going to associate in such a way. And then you're going to get older and you're going to start to kind of be a little bit more defensive of certain criticisms or certain education, right? That goes against your framework. And so it'll be a thing of like, you'll find yourself defending, your white friends and so forth, just because of the discomfort, right? And you're missing such a pivotal part of identity, right? And understanding in regards to who you are as a black person. And so fast forward and, as a black man, you've benefited from all of these, social structures. You've benefited from these social settings, right? You are aware of this sort of like hyper desirability, even if it is sexual, right? And that, brings a sense of admiration to you. That brings a sense of admiration and affirmation, right? And so it's kind of hard to backpedal Right. And so that's kind of why I don't really waste my time going down that path. Right. I got a book I got to read. It's why I'm no longer talking to white people about race. And I think that's sort of how I feel in terms of like why I would no longer talk to black men about honoring black women and families and all these. Like I just wouldn't go down that path. You know what I mean? And then I'll end by saying this too. I am also aware that, black women are not above critique. Right. And that's not just because they're black, but that's just because people are people, right? And we are opening up conversations and talking about, generational trauma, and we're talking about, familial abuse and so forth, friendship betrayals, right? We're talking about how, as much as we are empowered, as much as we are unified, we are still humans and we're fallible at the end of the day. And we are not always, walking in a way of, of truth and love and light, right? And so we're not riding off into the sunset. We are aware of the complexities of humans, right? And all of the fallible things that kind of come with that. So I just wanted to come on here and say that because I don't want anybody to feel dismissed. And I definitely don't. I want to be mindful of that. Yeah, I think, again, like I said, being a black woman, I have just a lot of compassion for black women. Undoubtedly, undoubtedly, right? So I just wanted to come on and share. I hope you guys got something from this. I hope I made myself very clear and just kind of clarifying that and not shutting anybody down or shutting down any, opposing views. I am going to post a poll on the channel today, and I'm going to be asking you guys, in regards to beauty, right? I was listening to Ain't I Woman. I am finally in chapter 4 of this audiobook. I can say I don't really like audiobooks. I don't really want to hear this. I don't want to hear anybody. I don't like the sound of people like reading to me unless it's like poetry and it's your stuff. You know what I mean? So I think that's why I've kind of struggled to get through this one in most audiobooks that I've tried to listen to. But I will say that in, reading this and checking this out, right? Bell Hooks talks about, obviously the standard of womanhood being that of a white woman, right? And enslaved and free black women, right, who were, nannies, elevator workers, right? She gave the example of an elevator worker who would, a black woman who would take white people up on the elevator. And I really loved how she phrased it. I'm going to try to paraphrase here, but she spoke about how she's going to be doing that for the rest of her life, right? And I remember being a young girl and, getting my first jobs and just kind of grieving how sure maybe we had access to certain material comforts or whatever as black people. Obviously, I was born in I'm not old, but I'm not young per se. But anyway, and I just remember sort of like grieving the ways in which the world was set up, because I think even as a young woman, and though I was not enslaved and so forth, it was like, wow, we really do serve white people. And that was a very humbling thing for me. But anyway, in the book, that's also in part why I was back and forth in school. And I think this is for a lot of young black youth, to be honest. I do think the world, we are progressing to an extent, right? It's not as bad as it was back then. I think, overt racism, has kind of, I ain't gonna say it's done away, but I do think that we are making, I don't know. I'm not gonna speak matter of factly, but I want to say this. She spoke about, obviously, for black women, the standard was that of the white woman, right? Ease, material comfort, all these different things. And how there was really this standard of perfection that black women had to aspire to, which was obviously unrealistic. And so here we are today, right? Fast forward 2026. And I posed the question on my community page. Please be sure to listen to this podcast all the way through so that you guys can get understanding and context of that question. And I asked, because you hear people say this all the time. And I think we can all look around and acknowledge that. Maybe we are on our phones or maybe just in real life, right? Women are becoming more and more increasingly beautiful, right? Whether it's, enhancements, whether it's makeup, whatever the case may be. We have access to certain beauty routines and all the different things now, right? I've actually seen a video of a black girl who had this really beautiful curly hair, and she goes to get this silk press at this celebrity salon, and it's obviously white people. And I'm thinking to myself, what would even make her go up in there, right? And, she comes out and her hair is ruined, or rather her curls are ruined. And, you have all of these, beauty brands like Taraji P. Henson and Fenty Hair, right, by Rihanna. And, they're like, I'm not Taraji P. I'm sorry. I meant to say Tracy Ellis. And they're like, hey, we'll send you some products to help you get your curls back. I'm so sorry that happened to you. And everyone's like, this should have never happened. And it made me sort of like, I felt like I experienced a little cognitive dissonance there, right? And so I asked the question, black women were, I think, developing a sense of confidence within themselves that I don't think we ever had before. And it wasn't from us being empowered in our blackness, and we weren't being uplifted, and we weren't, in that way, but there was this sort of like visibility in regards to beauty, right? And so I referenced this example of the black girl who goes to the white salon and they ruin her hair. And, there's sort of like this compassion and all these different things. And so I say all that to say, was this newfound confidence within black women because we were finally having equal access, right, to white women in their beauty routine, in third spaces, right, in friendships, and all these different things. Like, is that where the confidence was coming from? And it's not to talk about wigs, and it's not to tear down black women or anything like that. I do think that we should be conscious, and I think we should just be aware. Right. I think we should just be aware. I'm not being critical. I'm not being critical. I'm not being critical about black women loving themselves and having access to materials and beauty and all those different things, because historically, that's always been a thing, right? Women want to feel beautiful and so forth. But I am posing the question, is that newfound confidence coming from being right and in proximity to an extent to the materials and the access and all these different things of white women, and in listening to Ain't I Woman, right, when she posed the question, right, in terms of, that was the standard for black women, and it has always been, right, to be that of a white woman is to be a woman. And so you see a lot of these black women sort of like cosplaying femininity, and they come online and they have these really like soft voices, right? And I don't know what it is, but AI could tell you, unfortunately. But I don't know what it is, but I absolutely believe that the sound of a black person and a white person is completely different. And it's unfortunate because there's not a lot of research on this. There's not a lot of research in regards to African American people anyway, right? I'm getting ready to read an article about sleep deprivation and racism and how there's not enough studies on black sleep deprivation. And I think about this all the time when I'm tired, when I'm going through with my 1-year-old. I'm like, I'm absolutely exhausted. I'm enraged. I'm irritable. You know what I mean? And I think about for many black people who may be living in certain conditions and in certain environments where, good sleep is not a thing, right? And it could be that they're not even in a unsafe environment. It could just be bills are due, right? It could be economic survival. It could be this inability to rest because of the restlessness, because, one has to pay their bills and so forth, right? And so they just kind of talk about the lack of, diversification in terms of, research and clinical research. And so it's really interesting, I think, when I come on here and I pose certain questions and how there's really not a lot of research of it, right? It doesn't make any sense why we have to go back and reference studies done in 1979 when we were all aware collectively that we needed to be in the room, that we needed to be researchers, right? That we were going to go to college, and we were all aware that, and obviously I'm not going to say we were aware, but I meant to say college was a lot more affordable. Right. So education was a lot more affordable, and it was also more culturally and socially acceptable. It was also more economically rewarding. Right. Now we know that there are some trade-offs. Now we know that there are no guarantees, and there's all these sort of like nuances and complexities that kind of goes into obtaining a college degree. Right. Before, sure, there were PWIs and they were racist and there was all these different things, but now they're still there, but like, I don't know, the socialization is different, right? There is no collective understanding for black people, right? Many cultural centers at universities and more specifically at PWIs don't actually have black centers, right? The cultural center is usually for the Asian, for the African immigrant, right? It's not for African American people. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? But it is more so to acknowledge that the resources just aren't there, right? And so even when you do want to sit and kind of conceptualize and have conversations with other black people about microaggressions or feeling under supported or under researched, or not, I'm sorry, not under researched, but not being able to find certain information about your people, or, conduct certain clinical studies or whatever, right? There's not any funding, or, like I said, we shouldn't be referencing studies back in 1979, right? It's 2026. There's no way that we're constantly having to pull on historical context and research from years ago. So there is racism there, especially in terms of institutional spaces and institutional research. And so we always kind of be mindful, like I said, when we have conversations and we pose certain questions, because again, all we really can do is theorize, categorized at this point, right? The research does not often support African American people. And a lot of times people like to kind of throw in statistics and things like that. But the thing about statistics is that it just, again, it all depends on who is passing the word along. Okay, again, in the word of Clint Smith, okay, how the word is passed. Excuse me, it's no different than how statistics are communicated and what they're used for, right? People oftentimes are going to use statistics in a way that supports an argument that benefits them, right? And so there's nothing wrong with that to an extent, but it becomes problematic when it's framed as something that is, clear, concise, legitimate, fair, and unbiased, when it's not. Right? When you're referring to statistics and things like that, and people are under research, right? People are under surveyed or not surveyed at all, then we do have to sort of kind of question statistics. And I want to end by saying this. I don't necessarily think everything is a conspiracy as much as I think it's humans, and humans are fallible, and humans are underpaid, and humans, within American society more specifically, I don't want to say humans, but I'll say within American society specifically, we have always been about protecting the white fragility, and we've always kind of been about upholding the sanctification of whiteness. So whatever is going to frame white people in the best light, that's the narrative we're going to run with, and those are the statistics. I'm sorry, we're going to rely on, right? So we have to be mindful of that when we start trying to draw data points and make arguments with charts and graphs and things like that. We just have to be mindful. It's not to say that we need to throw it out. It's just to say we need to be mindful. And like I said, it's a shame that we have to reference studies from 2014. You know what I mean? In regards to African American people, it's a shame that we don't have enough research in regards to African American people. And I'll end by saying this too. I think it's very interesting, and I want to say this, right? Because I want to be clear, right? This video, the question, and I had to expound upon this as well, because it wasn't about attacking Black women and their beauty routines and Black women feeling beautiful, right? There are immigrant women who come here, Asian, right? Indian, right? Women who come to American society, and they too aspire to have that and be that and amass the same material access and resources and beauty care routines as white women. So it's not just a Black person thing. It's not just a Black woman's thing, right? So I hope you guys got something from this. This was a little long-winded. I thoroughly enjoyed explaining myself on this one here, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day.